we have lots of things that we can concretely design and can concretely design towards promoting more belonging and reducing othering. New people to our team, what are the rituals that we're going to do to invite them in? Are there games that we play? Are there check-in questions that we use? Are there meals that we host and have together? These are important things to design. These are things that we actually have within our control often.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. My team has my back. That's what the highest performing teams can say about each other. And how do you reach that feeling on a team? How do you build it? The first step is creating the feeling of belonging. That's easy to say, but unless you know how to do it, it's just talk. Well, today we're joined by an expert in creating belonging, design leader, author, and educator, Dr. Susie Wise. Susie teaches at the D.school at Stanford and coaches with the Mira Fellowship. Previously, she founded and directed the K12 Lab and at the D.school and co-created Liberatory Design. She's also the author of the new book that we're going to talk about today, Design for Belonging. In this episode, Susie and I talk about the role of belonging in the workplace and practical ways we can design belonging into work. We also talk about how to design moments in the life cycle of belonging like invitation, entrance, code switching, diverging, and exiting. And we get deep into the levers of belonging that we can pull to help set up an organization to create spaces and situations that foster feelings of belonging. Okay, without further ado, enjoy my conversation with Susie Wise. Susie Wise, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thank you so much for having me.
I have been absolutely delighted reading this book on three big levels. One is it's a book that taught me about design, which is fantastic. It's a book that taught me about belonging, which is fantastic. And honestly, it's a book that taught me about writing. And so I'm super excited to explore all of those aspects with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. It was definitely my intention to bring together the design piece and the belonging piece. That's why it's called Design for Belonging. So it's great to hear that both of those kind of resonated for you. I too found that it taught me a lot about writing. I'm excited to explore that with you.
As I mentioned before the show, the great thing about books by designers is that they're designed. And so this book, it's a beautiful book. And it's beautiful to touch. It's got raised lettering, so it has a tactile feeling to it in your hand as a physical book. And it's also super graphical and super colorful. And there's lots of things about it that I just find that it manifests the thing it's talking about. I really appreciate that. So I want to start off with this question, which is, tell me about a time when you didn't belong and then you felt like you did. And what did you feel, hear, touch, see that helped with that transition? And I ask that because I'd like to use that as a practical example as we go forward to talk about the rest of this.
Absolutely. So I can share the story that I tell in the book is about my family and when my mother got remarried, that feeling. And many things were shaped, reshaped relationally and structurally to help me feel belonging in my family ultimately. And I'd like to say that story has a happy ending. And I also know that your podcast is about work. So I thought I would share a story there. And that's a story of going to work for a tech company. And I was pretty excited to be there. I felt like I was really getting called in for some of my expertise. And I landed there and still pretty excited. And I got shown to it was like an executive cubicle, but it was still kind of a cubicle. But I knew it was kind of a cubicle's place. So I wasn't shocked by that. What shocked me and really made me question whether or not I belonged was that the person sitting behind me emailed me while sitting behind me to ask me if I wanted to go to lunch. And this was the person who I think was possibly assigned to be my buddy. He's like, good job on potentially creating a role to help with belonging. But my experience of it was totally othering. And I had this rush of fear of, oh boy, What have I done? And I think that's one of the markers of othering, is that the situation, not only does it make you question whether or not you belong, but it makes you question that you have done something. Have you caused it? Is it about you? When it's actually structural and kind of the cultural orientation of the way people were used to communicating here that hadn't been tuned to the fact that it was my very first day of work. So I definitely had that experience of, oh no. And I think that, oh no, can often be a sign, as I talk about in the book. You have to understand when and where you feel belonging and when you don't. And those signs of like, oh no, that's a sign that you're feeling not belonging. It doesn't necessarily mean that structurally you're not meant to belong, but that feeling is real.
Yeah.
And I will say then the things that started to help me to feel belonging there, and I did ultimately feel belonging in that team with that person and in the work of this company, was when I was able to see that I was making a contribution. That moment of contribution is often a really shifting moment. And when I was able to show up, it was maybe the first time I said something in a meeting and felt like, oh, I did something there to contribute to the conversation in the way that my role was designed to have me contribute. That helped me feel like I belonged. I think another piece and another kind of lever that can help with belonging is thinking about space. And I was, as you've already heard in kind of the slightly disparaging way I referred to the executive cubicles, I was pretty frustrated by the physical environment of this workplace. And I got invited to actually reshape it. And part of that was a little bit guerrilla. I had joined the company and this team with a colleague at the same time as another colleague who's also coming from stronger design backgrounds. And that person and I, we just hacked the cubicles. We asked permission, but permission was granted, and it sent a great sign to the rest of the team that space could be flexible. And then from that, I got invited into the conversation to help design a new space that was meant to feel like a more design-oriented space. So I got to then feel that bigger sense of like, actually showing up as myself helped people to see me. And then I was able to make a greater contribution.
Right. Make a greater contribution as yourself.
As myself.
There's a funny thing in there, because I had exactly the same experience when I joined Google. Not exactly. We didn't have cubes. But it was the feeling of not belonging. And I didn't really feel like I belonged until I felt I'd created value. And what's odd about that, it feels like maybe sometimes belonging needs to be bought. And that's probably entirely in my own head, the feeling that I need to buy my belonging.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I haven't heard anyone frame it that way, but that is underlying that is a sense of not being valued, of potentially being projected upon, but also just truly not being seen. And this is the interesting thing about designing for belonging, is that it's a back and forth. The feeling is always yours. And I like to say too, always right. Like your feelings are your feelings. So if you feel a little bit of not belonging, that's worth noticing. And then you can start to think about, wow, is that because I'm triggered in a particular way based on past experiences? Or are there structural things that are happening in this environment, in these relationships, in this context that are sending me cues that perhaps I don't belong? It's clearly a back and forth. And I think if we're thinking about folks, leaders, managers that are trying to create context of belonging, that what are all the ways that you help people show up and truly be themselves? That sends profound signals that you're seeking for people to feel like they can belong and that it's not transactional. That's relational.
Right. Transactional. I'm going to come back to that word. That's a super important word. So I want to come at belonging from a couple of different angles so we understand what it is. You already said a couple of the things, which is it's a feeling, and it's a feeling you have, which is always right. To what extent is belonging mostly something between people? And what I mean is, for instance, you talked about the space making you feel like you didn't belong. But ultimately, that space is a manifestation of the people who built the space who neglected you as a person. And so my question is, belonging always something that happens that we feel between us and people, or is it more?
So I think that's a really interesting and ultimately a profound question. And because it's a feeling, I would like to say that it is always between people. And we are showing up in places, contexts, and systems where the people that created that system have oftentimes become invisible. So we don't have a relational way to understand our belonging or the signs that are saying maybe you don't belong. And so in that, the space or the way the roles have been set up or the rituals, the event, etc., have invisible people behind it, then it's actually that those signs have come to live in things that aren't just people.
Yeah, somebody mentioned to me lately is that we often think of our company as a person. So we will personify the company itself. I was trying to think of an example to myself when I was framing this question of, is there any time I can think of where somebody has felt not belonging, including myself, where there was no person behind it? And a friend of mine moved from California, where he grew up, to Colombia. And when he got there, he wrote back that the trees here are not my friends. He did feel, I don't know if othering and alienation are the same thing, but he definitely felt alien. He felt alienated by things that no person was behind. It seems rare, but I can think of at least one example.
Yes. And again, I think in lots of those contexts, the people that have created the systems or the contexts are often invisible. So it doesn't feel like it's personal. And that's one of the things, and I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about, why it's not just a book about belonging, it's a book about design and belonging, is that design helps us remember the intention that has created everything that we're participating in, except perhaps the trees. Whether it's the structures of our work, the way the rules are created, the spaces that we're in, the way time is being used. Like the sun rises and sets on its own, but the way we structure our relationship to time is created by humans. And that's design. And so to remember that all the ways that we experience the world are designed also reminds us that they can be redesigned, because we're often not thinking about the intention of what was created. And many of the systems that can feel othering weren't intentionally designed to make a particular group feel bad, but the fact that they have done that. An example, we at the D.school at Stanford invited a teaching team as being led by a colleague, Darrell Coleman. He was working with students who were working with community members who used wheelchairs. They had physical disabilities and they used wheelchairs to move around for the whole of their life. And noticed, and they were invited in, welcomed into the D.school, but the height of the tables that we used in the studio were not adjustable and meant that they couldn't anyone in a wheelchair, also imagine younger children, etc., couldn't use the tables in the way that they were intended to be collaborative workspaces for these teams to design together. That is a subtle and also quite explicit experience of being othered. Again, not with malevolence, but with lack of foresight, and but the recognizing of that allowed that team to both adjust for that week or that workshop of working with folks in using wheelchairs, but also for the future. Why wouldn't we always have some tables of different heights? Because you never know what are the access needs of somebody coming into the space.
That's super interesting on a lot of levels. There's a couple things back in that statement that I want to go back to. First of all, I love design as a path to belonging. And the reason is innovation was the word for a while. We need to innovate. The thing about saying we need to innovate is it's sort of like being in New York and saying we need to jump to Paris. Saying you need to innovate doesn't say anything about how to get from like across the ocean. And you can't just jump there. There are certain things that teach us how to swim and that show us that you can swim and you can take one stroke and you know what, you're a little bit closer to Paris. And so, interestingly, design turned out to be the best path to innovation, which is it taught us how to swim to innovation. And it's a practical path. And I think that it's a super practical path to belonging too. And so, because what it does is it brings it down to there's things you can do. I really appreciate that. The second thing is you point out that it's neglect. So it's design neglect, which tells me that nobody's thinking about me.
Absolutely.
Neglect is a close neighbor to harm. I was talking to somebody recently who was talking about the idea of user composable design. And what he meant was design that allowed people to adjust, to tinker with, to modify the thing that they're given so that they can make it more suited to them. And it sounds like that's a little bit of what you're talking about when you say, I may not be able to predict everybody who's going to come into the room, but I can give them the ability to fit in.
Yeah. One of the things that I like to think about that might be related to that is just how you use small, scrappy, safe to fail experiments to understand what's working and what's not. So there are lots of moments of belonging to design for. An important and classic one is the invitation. If you are seeking for new folks to be a part of your environment and you're inviting folks in new ways, you can test that. You can try a new invitation, and that can be literally an invitation that comes in the mail or email or whatever, but it can also come in different forms. It could be a media asset that shares with folks something about your organization or team, and that functions as an invitation. That notion, then you get to test. You try a new invitation and you get to see who does show up, who hears that call and thinks, oh, that's for me. I should go there, join this, be a part of it. One of the pieces of that, I think, is just the design helps us to try things and remember that if what's happening in our context is not working, we can try something new. And that doesn't have to require a giant program and a rollout of some new way of working. It could actually be small scale and scrappy in order to see what's working.
The incremental nature of design makes it very safe. In other words, you can do small things and test it in reality as opposed to theory and see how it works. It's a powerful approach. I want to read the first line of this book because we were just talking about neglect and the neglect of things. And so the first line of this book is, hello, I'm so glad you're here. And it's the opposite of neglect. And it's such a simple thing. It's incredibly welcoming. And then later on in the same page, I think it's on the same page, although I don't say it right here, you say, this book, I'm writing it for you. And there's these two things that make it such an exemplar, I think, of the entrance moment, the moment of entering. Can you talk about the life cycle that you describe? And I have the name of it right here. You're going to have to remind me.
The moments of belonging?
Thank you. Yes, the moments of belonging. And what they are?
Absolutely. So the moments of belonging are things that I've noticed, and the invitation is for you to notice them, you, the listeners, to notice them in your own environment. And they may not be the same everywhere. So this is both functioning to just remind you that thinking about what are the concrete moments where we can either proactively support belonging or we can neglect it. So it's that reminder not to neglect. And I'll just say the range of them that I call out and then go back and talk about them. So I talk about the invitation, entering, participating. I talk about code switching, contributing, flowing, repairing, dissenting, and diverging and exiting. So there's a really wide range, and they're not sequential necessarily, although it does start with the invitation and entering and end with, in terms of a visual map, the diverging and exiting. So if we start at the kind of beginning, the notion of the invitation is exactly that. We want to, and again, this can be formal and explicit, or it could be the space. Does the space say to me, yes, you are welcome here. Please join us. The entry, I love calling that out. And in the book, I use this example of collaborating teacher at the D.school, Alita Hayes. She's a dance lecturer at Stanford, and she works with us on helping people to come into workshop experiences by dancing. And she really helps folks to think about the threshold, how you can walk through an entry and actually discover a new part of yourself if we pay attention to that threshold, that entry. It really matters. And there's so many subliminal things that happen at an entry point. You're receiving suddenly a whole ton of cues, and you're taking those in to say, do I belong here or do I not? I often think then of both the invitation and the entry as being a really important place to use storytelling in new ways so that people can really see themselves in a space or context. Kind of downstream from those are participating and contributing. I shared a little bit earlier, can be a really profound moment where you know you belong because you see that something you said, something that you made, just who you are has been taken up by the group, and kind of the gifts, as Peter Block describes them, your gifts have been received. That's a powerful moment of belonging, and getting to contribute is a part of that. And when I say contributing, I'm not meaning money. I'm meaning who you are, what, in a work context, what your work is. It might be ideas, it might be concrete things. That contribution really matters. I also call out code switching as a kind of moment to look for, because that's when folks are moving from dominant cultural modes to other more subculture modes. And that might show up in language, that might show up in dress, that might show up in lots of different ways. I think that's a really interesting moment to pay attention to, because it's a great sign if folks are able to bring multiple layers of their identity into the workplace, for instance.
Can you describe an example of code switching?
Sure. The notion of code switching comes out of linguistics, of just when do we use language in different ways. And we won't go into all the linguistics background there, but it's been taken up more broadly culturally to understand that we have dominant cultures. We might call that white supremacy culture. We might just call that a dominant corporate culture. And then, of course, every individual, no matter what culture you're a part of, has different aspects of your identity. And so those might show up. We often, code switching, again, from linguistics comes from language. So you have let's call it, and I'm doing air quotes, non-standard English or non-business English ways that you might speak. Lots of subcultures have that. So that's a symbol that you're showing, that you're revealing, that you're participating in other aspects of your cultural identity when you're using language in different ways. And when I say language, that could be more than just spoken language, right? That could be different kinds of attributes. It could be gestures. Again, it could be things like clothing, etc. Why I wanted to include it as a kind of moment to think about for belonging is because we all have multiple aspects of our identity. And if they get to show up or not, and how many layers of our identity get to show up, I think is a powerful symbol of how inclusive a work environment is really trying to be.
Yeah, it's interesting. I can certainly, now that you've described it, think of examples of it. It's like you code switch when you go to work versus when you're with your family.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
A couple other moments just to talk about that I think are important to think about is repair. In our world, there are harms. What the lack of intention, the potential for harm is real, whether intended or not, particularly when unintended. When harm is noticed, we have to be able to repair. And so that's a powerful moment to know, do we have mechanisms for repair, and what are they? And how human and relational are they? And related to that, I call out this moment of dissent. And this is a little bit drawing on some of the work of John Powell. It helped me to think about the notion that part of belonging is being able to make demands on the structures of your organization or cultural space. We're unpracticed in dominant corporate cultures with really thinking about what dissent is. I think, and kind of argue for in the book, that normalizing dissent and actually recognizing it as a measure of belonging can be really helpful, because you're not going to raise an issue, right, that might be hard for you to lift up. You're not going to do that unless you have some sense of belonging. You have to have some psychological safety, willingness to tread into potentially difficult territory to really raise issues. So I think that's very important to practice with and to recognize that it's part of any thriving culture of belonging.
Yeah. I can't remember where I read this recently. It was about talking about customers, a marketing book, which is that it was Theodore Levitt. He said that when your customer stops complaining, you've lost your customer. It also, there was another quote from, I think, True Professionalism, which was, nobody tells you when they stop trusting you. And so it's these things where at least you're in relationship still when somebody can dissent.
Yes, absolutely. I just think it's a profound measure of belonging.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And we have invitation, we have entering, that moment of entering, we've got participating, we've got code switching, we've got contributing, flowing, which I'm not sure I could recognize, so I might come back to that, dissenting, repairing, and diverging. What's diverging?
Yeah, I call it out as diverging and exiting. This is just the recognition that because you feel belonging, that's not your entryway into being trapped, and that we all are, there are these ebbs and flows in the way we work and live. And so we're part of a community. We may not always be a part of a community, and that's okay. That's something that a moment that we can design for. How do people, right? A classic thing is the design of a graduation or a retirement party. I feel like those are a little stale. Could we bring more intention to what is it to have some of those moments of exiting, in fact, and let them be very pro-belonging? How are they supportive of who you are and how you might loop back to this organization or learning institution? Also, how do you carry with you the kind of belonging that you had in that, let's say, the club? You were a scout and you're leaving because it's that age where you leave, but you get to carry it with you, and recognizing how belonging also continues. I think designing for that can be interesting.
It's beautiful. I love the idea of essentially collecting communities of belonging, which is you don't leave them, you get to carry them with you. If you manage it right. Good example, by the way, is university emeritus programs. My father was given bench space, which in a lab, that's how you know that you still belong, is that you have a bench where you can do lab work. I like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Stanford has a new program that they call, I think it's called the Distinguished Career Institute. And it's an invitation to folks, not just who were professors and are emeritus, but who have had careers in different sectors and are looking to join with other senior folks and have a university-based experience. It's a way to loop back to a university at a later stage in your career.
Lovely. I'm going to have to look into that. So the way I asked this question to myself when I was reading the book, I always ask this question about design. What is the thing designed made of? Because eventually I'm going to act on something that is going to create this experience, and I don't know what the medium is. And you actually addressed it, and you call it something which is the levers of belonging, which is these are the things that you're going to be working in. And I don't think it's necessarily exhaustive, but I would love to talk through some of those things.
Yes, like the moments are not exhaustive, the levers of design are not exhaustive. And so I'm using them to remind us that we have lots of things that we can concretely design and can concretely design towards promoting more belonging and reducing othering. And this is in part because we have this default design lever that I think folks often use, which is the email. I want to do a new thing and I have a new policy, I have a new idea, I have a new welcome that I want to try out. And so I'm going to send an email. And email's great. I'm not knocking email. We would not be here if not for email. And we have so many other things. So we've talked a little bit about space. Physical space sends us to our human bodies and minds. It sends us so many cues. So the way that we use space, can it be open and airy? Is it story-filled? These are ways that you can tune a space to create belonging. Space can also be tuned to be very specific, to draw on kinds of belonging in specific subcultures or corporate cultures. I love to talk about role. We often think that roles have always been there. Walmart has greeters. We didn't always have Walmart, and Walmart did not always have greeters. That's because, right, they noticed that they needed this way to invite people into the space. And so they created the greeter role. Or I talk about an organization called the Future Project. They created a new role that they call dream directors. Dream directors are an evolution of a high school guidance counselor. But instead of being about tracking your credits, they're about helping you think about your dream. That is such a profound lever, I think, of belonging. And that you're actually asking somebody, what is your dream? And they've created a role to ask that. That is just such a pro move, I think, in terms of using a role in a new way. And there are endless numbers of those. We were just talking about the moment of dissent. Maybe in a meeting, you just create a new role, which is like, you're going to be the dissent person. And so you can be the one who just says, hey, before we end this meeting, let's just see, are there any differing opinions that still need space to be heard? Or I'm just calling right now for dissent. That's a kind of role. So it can be micro of a new role in a meeting just for one time as kind of a micro version. Or maybe it's a role that you've really decided needs to be part of the culture of work. So role, I think, is a profound lever that we often overlook and think are fixed. I also talk about ritual and events. These are levers, again, which sometimes can be stale. They're just things that we've always done. And we can bring new energy to them to say, wow, we are inviting in a whole bunch of new people to our team. What are the rituals that we're going to do to invite them in? Are there games that we play? Are there check-in questions that we use? Are there meals that we host and have together? These are important things to design. And often, again, from the design side here, I'm pushing us just to remember that these are things that we actually have within our control often and can use to create. And those can extend. That's thinking about your family context or other community organizations as well.
Yeah. You mentioned in the book that in terms of rituals, I think that eating of food together, something I always recommend to leaders is that they invite everybody to their house and cook together and have a meal together. And it's one of the most connecting activities that you can do. A lot of these levers challenge you to think differently about them, which is, okay, what's the default thing you're going to do? The default thing you're going to do is you're going to go to some loud restaurant where everybody else is dressed exactly the same with badges, and you're going to try to shout over each other while you eat something that's pretty good, actually, usually. On the other hand, you can get together and you can be in a quiet place and you can break the mold. And so I think by calling out each of these levers, there's an opportunity to expand beyond the standard.
Yeah. Well, I love what you said there about break the mold. I think of like, how do we use design to disrupt? And particularly if you feel like you have a culture where you're not feeling the belonging across the team or the organization, that's an important moment to try some new things. And so thinking about just a broad set of levers that maybe aren't what you usually use can be really illuminating. It can be exciting. It can be a little intimidating too, just to acknowledge that. But I think it's powerful. And again, in the book, I only talk about, I think, 9 different levers. But there's also a page where you think about there's so many more things to do, right? How do we use groupings? How do we use time in other ways? Those are ones that I do mention. I think remembering that time is not fixed. In some ways, the pandemic has helped us to notice that we have to use time differently, that we can use time differently, that we have just on a cultural scale used time in some different ways. I think that's a really interesting one in this moment to play with as well.
Yeah, I agree. Downtime,
Yes.
quiet time. Let's not be in a rush for a second.
That's even a different, like the kind of fast and slow culturally, tempo. I think that's even an interesting way to think differently about code switching. That's a way to kind of to think about what that is as well.
Yeah. So in my regular life, I design systems. And I don't mean technology. I mean big, mostly processes, but I've also spent a lot of time as a business architect. And one of the challenges there, and this is what probably my greatest fascination in life is the experiences created by large systems. And one of the things that your book reminds me of is that we don't experience large systems. We experience the outcomes of large systems because every single one of the levers is something that I'm going to experience first person and in the present. And it's not some faraway system thing. It may be a manifestation of the system, but is system still a lever? And should I specify what I mean by system?
Sure.
I mean, in a workplace, you could talk about a performance management system. It's all the steps you go through to determine how you might need to develop and how you're doing in terms of your performance. A lot of it's policy, for instance. A lot of it is made of sequence, but it's big.
I'm happy to jump in there and say that we're always living in systems and we're also living in concrete moments. And there's this back and forth between them. We can't experience a system as a whole. We can experience its impacts and its effects. And I think from a design perspective, then we have to be able to break it down and design specifically. I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't think about the system because there are also systems can become oppressive in part because their parts become invisible and their intention becomes the norm. And so seeing the parts of a system is very important, and seeing how systems distribute power, how they distribute, in fact, belonging can be super important and a key kind of analytic investigation to do. And again, in this book, I'm talking about feeling. We also have to hold in that this is being experienced by individuals and also by groups in particular ways. And we want to be paying attention to that from a feeling perspective.
Yeah, my wife teaches kindergarten to kids who are both native Spanish and native English speakers. And one of the things I see in the system is that Spanish speakers can either be framed as having a deficit of English, or they can be framed as having a surplus of, a superpower of Spanish.
There's also the superpower in there that is of the bilingualism and of that ability to code switch. That's a version of code switching, which is a really profound ability.
It really is. It's actually, by the way, my wife's superpower, which is that she grew up in rural Mexico and Palo Alto. And so she can work with a population of parents who are from either place. It's this very weird, very specific multiculturalism that she has. And so a part of that is, if I assume that Spanish speaking is a deficit, that's going to bleed through in everything. And so there's essentially there's the design of assumption that could potentially be a lever.
I think assumptions are outcomes of systems in some ways more than they are a lever of design. I would push us there to think whenever we're noticing assumptions, that's very important. Noticing assumptions is key across the board, whether it's a work group, school group, community group, understanding our assumptions, any kind of work that you're doing. I always advise doing an assumption storm. It's one of the exercises in the book of in a given context, what are the assumptions that we're making? And one, we both want to understand those, but we also then have the potential to flip them if any of them are harmful, or we're looking to kind of expand our idea set. So assumption storming can be used in a lot of different ways and can be really powerful. So I think assumptions are something to look for and kind of take in as some really interesting data.
Here's like one of the biggest questions that I think all my listeners will care about, which is if I'm a leader, I want to bring more design for belonging into work. It's kind of a question of who do I bring in? Do I bring in designers? Who are designers? What do I start to put into my company that might help this to happen?
I might take one step back and say to do a little investigating about where the gaps in belonging are before you decide, because then you could craft some new kinds of roles to support greater belonging. I might get a subset of folks to do an emotional journey map of their ups and downs of belonging to help you pinpoint some moments that really matter and then dig into those. If what you're finding is that it's about the onboarding that you need help, or if you're finding it's more about contributing, or maybe it's more about how people give critical feedback, that might then influence who you bring in to help you think about it. Absolutely, designers are going to be part of it, particularly designers that have an orientation towards experience design. And then with an additional lens of organizational design, that could be really powerful. I'm also interested, though, in folks that know about events and know about great ways of getting folks to collaborate, which might be somebody that has more of a coaching background. That might be somebody that has a background just where they've had to collaborate a lot. They have kind of a high impact. So think about producers or other folks that are used to working across teams with that represent lots of different disciplines. Those are the kinds of folks that I think are going to be potentially really able to help generate ideas around new interventions. And when you're trying new interventions, the thing is to not start big, not start with a big rollout, but to start small and scrappy and experimental. Try multiple things.
First of all, it totally makes sense to me, which is that if it's an onboarding issue, that's the biggest issue. It might be event planning if you do big onboarding events. But if it's something about how performance management is working, it might be someplace else. And then it's multidisciplinary. One of the questions I have is whether design needs to be part of everybody's job. And so then on one hand, there's these people who are really professional designers. And then there's other people like managers who might need to pick up skills around design. And so I'm wondering if this is an ambient capability for an organization or if it's localized around a few experts.
I tend to think of it as ambient. That's in part because I think of all humans as, in some ways, designers. That we're constantly thinking about what's happening in our environment and how we might want to change it. So a team manager, to me, is constantly designing experiences. And so what I most want is for leaders of all kinds, whether or not design is in their title or not, to really lean into thinking about intentionally designing the way teams come together, the way teams speak to each other, the way teams share their work. These are all moments that can be designed for greater belonging.
And do all of us play a role in designing a world, co-creating a world in which we belong? So is it a one-sided activity or is everybody participating in their own belonging?
Absolutely, everyone is participating in their own belonging. I think one of the reasons that I advocate for using the frame of belonging beyond inclusion, because inclusion, at least how it's been used, often has the kind of power dynamic in it of I can include you in this team. I can include you in this work. Belonging is actually everyone's to behold and experience it as they do. So belonging is a feeling that I have. There are many things that can be designed to help me feel it in a given specific context. Belonging is mine to own and experience.
Is that a skill set that I might acquire, like an ability to design or create an environment in which I belong?
I think it's an interesting question. And I think I'm going to stop myself from answering it definitively. But I will say one of the host heroes in the book is Brene Brown, because she talks about the notion of true belonging. And true belonging is something that you carry with you, that you know that you are whole and you carry that with you. There are lots of threats that are unevenly distributed in our culture, whether it's work culture or our broader culture. There are lots of identity threats that impact one's ability to know that and feel that in all contexts. So let's not be naive that it's just, I work on my belonging and I can feel it everywhere. No. And yet it is yours. And so I think the ability to carry it with you can be a really beautiful thing. And we also have to hold context accountable for the ways that they cue folks, particularly from underrepresented groups, from previously disenfranchised groups, cue intentionally or not, that you might not belong. And so your experience is actually more one of identity threat or potential othering or not belonging than we would like to imagine. You can't fall down on one side or the other. And of course, the potential to get to that place of having a sense of true belonging and carrying it with you is an incredible thing to feel when you can feel it.
That sounds incredibly appealing. So this is a question I ask everybody at the end of every interview, and it has to do with my own research about what people want from work. And so, what job do you hire your job to do for you?
Thank you. I love this question. And I've asked it now of a couple other people. And so I might be developing a little subset of data for you too. But I think, and this might not come as a surprise, but in this moment for me, I am really thinking about how I hire a job to help me belong. I'm very much freelance right now, and I'm hoping to find a next work home. And that has brought me closer to the idea that I am seeking a next organizational context where I can really belong.
I love that phrase, a work home. So home being, to some extent, a stand-in for belonging. I belong in my home.
Yes, I think so. And in some ways, I've been thinking about it with having a book. I'm looking for a place where the book can land and find its home.
And it comes back to this, to some extent, I think, the idea of a place where the book and the ideas in the book can be absorbed to create value.
Absolutely.
It's something we talked about really early on in the interview about how producing your unique value in a space is a part of what gives you belonging.
Yeah, that contribution. And I'm hoping a book, the cool thing about it is it's tangible and it can go everywhere. I don't have to go with it. But I am curious about what it will look like to find a place where these ideas are resonant and I can take them further.
Have you had ideas before that didn't find a home?
Ooh, that's a cool question. I'll say one of the pieces of work that I did just before starting to work on belonging was a framework called liberatory design, which is trying to look at how we bring equity, complexity, and design together, and a kind of an iteration of the modes of human-centered design, and then also really naming some important mindsets if one wants to use design to work towards equity. So that work definitely found a home in the work and among the team that created it. But the institutional home that I was in at the time didn't necessarily want that work. So that was interesting to see where it needed to go in the world, which is maybe why I'm now trying to figure out where will design for belonging go in the world because of that experience.
Another interesting thing about the book is that I can't remember exactly the term you used. Was it host heroes?
Yes, host heroes.
Host heroes, which is, just to say, it's a handful of thinkers in the area of belonging. One of the striking things about the book is that when you enter into it, you're surrounded by those host heroes. You really are among them.
I'm so glad you felt that, because that's what I wanted it to feel like.
That's what it feels like. It does that. Thank you very much for coming on the show. We had a power outage right in the middle, and we had to start again and days later, and thanks for all your time arranging that. I really have enjoyed it, and I've already started using a lot of your book in my actual job, changing the way we design for belonging. So, thank you.
Hallelujah. I love it. And I've really enjoyed meeting you, Dart. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.